There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition. And it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. You unlock this door with the key to imagination. Beyond it, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. A journey into a wondrous land whose boundaries are that of imagination. That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. The Twilight Zone is a work of art so monumental that it needs no introduction. A television series so distilled into the modern culture that it is understood to some degree by everyone, even those who have in fact never seen a single episode. And is a show that I believe one can learn a great deal from, not just on character, and how to model oneself to be a person who understands themselves and how their actions fundamentally affect everything around them, but also to deepen their understanding on art, the power structures of our world, expression, the commodity of time, and how to be a better writer and human soul. It needs not be stated that it is one of my favorite shows of all time, and has always been something that I have wished to cover in some form for many years. And now, here we are. But before we talk about the show, we must first talk about Rod Serling himself. To understand the series fundamentally, I think you have to understand the man who created it. Art is, by its nature, an extension of the person who birthed it into existence. It is an expression on the part of the artist, and as such, is intrinsically connected to that artist. And any attempt to remove the artist from examining a work as a whole is only done to justify commodifying and consuming a work of art that is made by a shitty person, or at least someone who has done a shitty thing. Separate art from the artist is a mantra for the uninquisitive, or those who lack backbones or morals. Serling's brand of sci-fi and horror fantasy is one that is extremely grounded through the use of metaphor, and how it reflects our world around us, and how that relates to us as people, and more specifically, how that relates to us as citizens of the United States of America. The Twilight Zone is a show that is extremely concerned with the American experience and all that entails with that. It is the existential horror of living in the American system personified and filtered into small slices of microscopic 20-minute storytelling vignettes. I think the following quote is kind of one of the best distillations of his own work that he ever said, and will help us to understand how he approached the development process of his scripts and concepts. I would probably shy away from the year 2500. I would much rather deal in 1998. The hardware that I use, I think, should be identifiable. I like to know what happens Thursday, not in the next century. One of the other things that I think is just blatant truth that needs to be acknowledged is that Rod Serling was one of the most vocal leftists within American media to ever have the platform as large as the one that he had at his disposal. There's just no other way to look at the man and still exist within something that could conceivably be described as reality. As we will see in each of these stories that Serling wrote, he was primarily concerned with the evils that the government was doing to its people, the evils that people do under the persuasion of propaganda to each other, and why community is the most needed aspect of the human condition, and how people are all that we have, and are the only path forward to collective prosperity. And the fact that he was doing this, and on average 20% of the people in the country were watching him do it on a weekly basis, is not only a testament to his ability as a writer, but also to the power that horror holds as a storytelling tool to reach people who might otherwise not be reached through more traditional methods, such as pundits or journalists. But also as creating a blueprint for how to demonstrate a form of provoking social change that has not often or maybe ever been recreated at this scale. We talk about the problem of how to bring people over to the left, but not often enough, I feel, do we actually talk about why these things have for decades been prominent in the art that we produce, and why it needs to be a key cornerstone of building a more loving and functioning world. And more than anything else, just like how everything in the second half of the 1900s was, Serling was a man who was molded by World War II, and its impact on his art is impossible to fully express. To an extent, everything in the 1950s and 60s was a reaction to World War II. And in that same mindset, every word that Serling wrote in his time was as well. I'd like to be able to say that Serling spent his youth killing Nazis, but to both mine and his disappointment, and maybe yours as well, that isn't explicitly true, as when he signed up to fight in the war, he was instead sent to the Pacific to fight in Japan, something which he protested against to little avail. And I will be upfront. Probably the biggest baggage that you will find with Serling is that he will occasionally in interviews drop something super racist about the Japanese, which is something that people just sort of sweep under the rug when talking about his work. I'm not excusing that at all, and I do bring it up with intention because I think every single aspect of his life and body of work should be filtered through the lens of him being a World War II vet, who grew increasingly disgusted with the American system that he existed within, and how it functioned from basically the top down. And his writing was constantly concerned with that, but he was only human, and occasionally did say some things that very much felt like they were right out of the 1960s, which I think should be acknowledged. And it does need to be reiterated that Serling was not entirely, I believe, purposefully racist, and was extremely progressive for his time. As an example of that, he said the following in 1961 about the culture of the United States when he was young, in relation to the culture of television at the time of the creation of the Twilight Zone. There was certainly a race problem in those days. It wasn't out in the street. It wasn't loud in our ears. It wasn't infesting our gut, our conscious gut as it is today. But by God, there was as much anguish amongst minorities then as there is now. The purpose, the point of a dramatic show which is used as a vehicle of social criticism, is to involve the audience, to show them where in their guilt lies, or at least indeed their association. But when you're talking about a bunch of cavalry men knocking off a bunch of poor redskins and putting them into a reservation, the audience need to have no association. Certainly no guilt, because how many Indians did they push into a reservation? But if indeed you talk about the denial of a man putting his garbage can next to yours, whether he fought in Vietnam or whatever, by virtue of his color, then you're getting into a universal guilt, which they should feel guilty for, or at least in part understand. I do believe that the nature of the times do demand that television takes positions, that it exposes both sides of controversy. We have to tell them a story of prejudice in parable form, in which they may step aside as a third person and say how awful we treat our minority groups. It's simplistic, but at least they know that it's an evil, that people can recognize it as such, and by osmosis or some incredible process, somewhere along the line be faced with a situation where they too could exercise a prejudice, and be conscious of it as an evil. On Twilight Zone, we made comments on prejudice, on conformity, on intolerance, and censorship. But it's easy to do that when you're talking about Buck Rogers, who's not allowed to write his memoirs in the way that he wants them to. And so he puts on his rocket pack and zips over to the publishers. And the audience applauds and laughs and says, how interesting. And it very well may be that the inner message may never get through, but I think preferably it does get through. And you can imagine that in the making of a show of this nature, that he would be met with constant frustrations of what he was and was not allowed to explicitly express on television. You can't say political parties by name on television in a dramatic show. You can't have a protagonist who's a Democrat and an antagonist who is a Republican. You can't do it. Consequently, we sort of pre-censor ourselves. You have to be very careful also in your depictions of the issues at hand. For example, if the president happened to be more oriented to big business or something, then you'd think in terms of political history of the Republican Party, is more oriented to big business, and the Democrats are more associated with labor unions. But on TV, you can't have your president be a big, strong union man, because that carries with it the suggestion of being a Democrat. But it is possible to have a communist be the villain in your script. And it was these frustrations that in part led to the creation of the Twilight Zone in the first place. Serling primarily made a name for himself in the 50s writing politically tinged material for television, on shows such as Playhouse 90, which he helped to develop. This show was an abnormality at the time for a number of reasons, but it was fairly popular. The show broke the format of the traditional television drama, which had always been 30-minute episodes, and instead tried to replicate the feeling of going to the theater by adapting plays for television audiences that were 90 minutes long. Now, this was popular not just because of the famous guests that they could get for each episode, but also because it was a very writer-focused show by its nature, as each episode lived and died by the quality of the teleplays that were being produced. And this certainly aided in making Serling somewhat of a household name before he even started The Twilight Zone, as he wrote 11 of these episodes, plus was a guest writer on a number of shows throughout the 1950s. He was handsome and well-spoken, and became a popular guest for more intellectually leaning American talk shows. A lot of people certainly would have known who he was and what his whole deal was, but the exact reason as to why they started The Twilight Zone was because of issues that Serling ran into on shows like Playhouse 90, where he was constantly being restricted in the kind of material that he could cover. This all came to a head in 1956, when Serling wrote a script for a variety anthology series called The United States Steel Hour, which ended up being quite controversial in front of and behind the scenes. The script, titled Noon on Doomsday, was written out of a reaction to the recent killing of Emmett Till. Serling, having dealt with executives for years at this point, pre-censored himself in his script when tackling the Till case, removing the story from the American South, and making the main protagonist be an adult Jewish man instead of a young black boy. The idea being that he could communicate to the human and structural problems at the heart of the issue of the Till story, and the corrupt rot that the core of the American spirit is centered around, without, actually calling a spade, and insinuating that a good amount of the people in the southern half of the country consisted of racists, which, tends to not go over super well. Now, I'm going to read you this quote from Serling about the mindset of why he was writing this, that on the surface doesn't sound so great. But I really want you to think about what he is saying here, because ultimately what I think he's trying to communicate is that he wants to get to the root of the idea of how structurally within the systems that exist, people can be protected after they do a monstrous thing. He isn't saying that race did not matter in the Till case, but instead is trying to examine what happens after an act of violent racism has occurred. He said, "It struck me at the time that the entire trial and its aftermath was simply, they're bastards, but they're our bastards. So I wrote a play in which my antagonist was not just a killer, but a regional idea. It was the story of a little town, banding together to protect its own against outside condemnation. At no point in the concept of my story was there a black-white issue." In the lead-up to the episode being produced, a reporter asked Serling about the script, noting similarities to the Emmett Till case, which he merely responded by saying, "Well, if the shoe fits." This prompted the White Citizens Council of America to boycott the network, which was a lobbyist organization that was somewhat powerful at the time, that had peak membership of around 70,000 wealthy white people, that opposed all aspects of black people gaining social recognition or civil rights within American culture and society. Serling would then say on what happened next. "The script was gone over with a fine-tooth comb by 30 different people, and I attended at least 2 meetings a day for over a week, taking down notes as to what had to be changed. My victim could no longer be anyone as specific as an old Jew. He was to be called an unnamed foreigner, and even this was a concession to me, since the agency felt that it should not really be a suggestion of a minority at all. This was too close to the Till case. Further, it was suggested that the killer in the case was not a psychopathic malcontent, just a good, decent American boy momentarily gone wrong. It was a pure six brawl to stop this alteration of character." The script was then dissected and combed, so that every word of dialogue that might remotely be Southern in context could be deleted or altered. At no point in the script could the word lynch be used. No social event, institution, way of life, or simple diet could be indicated that might be Southern in origin. And to carry the above step even further, a geographical change was made in the script so that instead of being a little town of undesignated location, it was shoved as far north as possible, making it a New England town. This was to be a total surrender, and there would be no concessions made even to logic. It was in this time period that Serling sold a standalone science fiction teleplay to CBS titled The Time Element, that could be viewed as the first actual episode of what The Twilight Zone actually became. As an artist, he was pushed from all angles to science fiction and horror as a means to safely explore his ideas and converse what was true to his heart as a person. I do not think that Serling especially liked science fiction or horror. He did not work within the mediums until forced to do so, and I have little reason to believe that he was someone who was actually passionate about it. And his success within those genres is a testament to his ability as a writer, despite his somewhat uninterest in them. And I think he was also aided in not being particularly a fan of those works, seeing them more as a tool to be wielded more than operating as an outright fan. I do not necessarily think he was against science fiction at all. I think he very much respected his contemporaries in the genre, and that he read a great deal of horror and science fiction in his free time. But I also think that if the conditions existed for him to write more straightforward political television genres without overreach, then that was the path that he would have taken. But unfortunately for him, that was a path that did not exist in the late 1950s, or at least not for him. But even with the creation of the show, as we will see, Serling would still face constant issues of censorship and pushback from network executives, even when working in ideas that were purely of the fantastical, and utterly detached from any real constructs, such as a political party that actually existed. He'd follow up The Twilight Zone with a spiritual sequel horror anthology titled The Night Gallery, and in the early 70s he'd say the following about still facing these issues this deep in his career. They say it's Rod Serling's Night Gallery. It isn't really Rod Serling's Night Gallery, it's somebody else's. I write a few of the scripts and I front the show, but it doesn't remotely belong to me. But I also have no proprietary interest in that at all. The show was supposed to be a much more cerebral exercise. It was supposed to be much more diversified in its approach to things. It could be all things, science fiction and fantasy, and the occult, and the bizarre. But unfortunately, it has been an inconsistent show, and it may do very well. I just wish they'd use somebody else other than me. I used to think I had creative control at one point, until the phone stopped ringing for weeks, and then I kept wondering, when are they going to ask me? And they never asked me. I think in all media, be it film or TV, the writer should exercise a great deal of control. I see scripts of my own on television and I wonder who wrote them. I don't recognize them. People aren't there that I wrote about. Lines are said that I did not write. Concepts are produced which I had no knowledge of. And that's the problem of television. And so as we get deeper into the show, it's important to note that things that do not work very well or have aged very badly might actually be a result of network meddling, and was not how things were intended or originally envisioned. This special, The Time Element, was advertised and aired as a single event, but was so popular with audiences that in the weeks following its broadcast, CBS received over 6,000 letters in the mail, asking them to give Serling his own show to run in that very style, which is what prompted them to commission a pilot. It was well received, and the rest is basically history. Although, truthfully, it is a little bit more complicated than just that, as genre fiction at the time, just as it still is today for the most part, was seen as a lesser form of expression by some, that would lead to Serling being treated with occasional prejudice in the media, such as when in 1959, Mike Wallace famously asked him on his talk show, "You're going to be, obviously, working so hard on The Twilight Zone, that in essence, for the time being, and for the foreseeable future, you've given up on writing anything important for television, right?" Now, The Time Element, sadly to my knowledge, is never included with any Twilight Zone box sets, and I guess it probably really shouldn't be. It is not canonically actually a part of the show. And as such, though, it has always been difficult to find a decent copy of it, which explains the quality of the visuals that you're seeing here. And while it clearly is the foundational first step to getting to the Twilight Zone, it also differs quite a lot from what that show would eventually be. First off, it has a runtime of 50 minutes instead of 20, which I think does harm it. As you will eventually see, Season 4 of The Twilight Zone heavily experimented with the format, which included going to hour-long specials instead of the previous 20-minute ones. And I think that this was a bad move. Serling is guilty of getting a little talk-heavy when he has the space for it in the script. But being contained to just 20 minutes made him concise with his ideas in a way that made the show what it was. He was iconic when restricted to short bursts, and I personally feel that you can sense the bloat in the time element where you otherwise might not in your average episode of the actual show. Like, half of this could have easily been cut. They introduce the weird thing in the first 5 minutes and then just spin their wheels into the last 10 minutes or so, just saying, "Oh wow, this is so crazy, wow, this is so weird," 15 different ways. As far as plot is concerned, it is basically a mashup of 2 episodes that we will cover today that came early in Season 1, Perchance to Dream and Judgment Night. And when we get to that part of this video, you'll see what I mean. The story follows a man who is visiting a psychiatrist for the first time in his life because of a recurring dream that he is having, where, despite it being 1958 in real life, he is constantly dreaming of being back in 1941, right before the attack on Pearl Harbor. And no matter what he tries, he can't get anyone to give him the time of day to listen to him, and what he has to say about the warning about the impending attack. Most find him to be insane, or to be a drunk, and every night he has to constantly dream of these men and these women doomed to die horrific deaths, who he knows that he could save if they would only just listen. a message to the basic inner way that humans work to a degree. The horror of being unable to stop what you know to be inevitable, and yet totally preventable. And about how even decades later, the men who were there are not able to move away from what happened there in World War II. Mentally, when they close their eyes, they too were transported to a time and place of young men who would all soon be killed. They see the faces of those who were needlessly slaughtered. And that is really what is at play here in this story. That, while good, is not representative of what Serling could really do and is far from his best work. But with that, we'll move on to the beginning of what you're all here for, with the pilot episode of The Twilight Zone.
All I can tell you is that we think The Twilight Zone is pretty unique. We think it'll be much talked about, and we think it'll also be enjoyed. We think it's the kind of a show that will put people on the edge of their seats, but only for that 1/2 an hour. We fully expect they'll go to the stores on the following day and buy your products. We think it's that kind of a show. So now the ham walks off to allow the real object and point to entertain you. The pilot show of your series. Earl Holliman, James Gregory, starring in Where Is Everybody? So, gentlemen, please sit back and take your first trip into the Twilight Zone.
Mike Ferris finds himself walking into town on a dirt road in the first real episode of the show. He wears a military uniform, but he doesn't know why. He doesn't know his name, or where he is, or how he even got there. He doesn't really remember waking up this morning. His existence began on that desolate country lane where we found him. The town of Oakwood that he finds at the end of that lane is the personification of small-town America. There is a quaint diner, a nice clean town square. But the thing about this town that separates it from all others of its kind is that in the town of Oakwood, there's no people who live there. No one to man the grill, no one to pump gas, no one to sell books or goods to in the general store. It is a town, it seems, entirely created for Mike Ferris and only for Mike Ferris. A place for him to inhabit, a simultaneous god and plaything of the space that he has found. There are phones, but they cannot call out. Any technology that could possibly reach the outside world is merely a prop in this theatrical set of a community. And over the course of what seems like a few days, we watch as Ferris slowly loses all semblance of himself, and in that, his rationality. He begins to hallucinate movies playing in the theater, a cigar still smoking in an ashtray. He hugs a post in the town square and cries out alone to himself, "Please, won't somebody help me?" Only to then cut to a group of military officials watching a screen in a large hangar in front of a futuristic-looking box. Ferris's face is on that screen and he is in the midst of a deep emotional episode. One of the generals tells another at the end of the experiment to open the box and to let him out. 484 hours and 36 minutes. That was how long he was in there with wires hooked up to his central nervous system, and an experimental trial of a technology that could occupy the minds of astronauts on future trips to the moon, the stars, and beyond. When defending this to the press and explaining why Ferris experienced the breakdown that he had near the end of the trial, the top general tells them, "If any one of you were confined to a box 5 feet square for 2.5 weeks, all by your lonesome, without hearing a human voice other than your own, I'd give you especially good odds that your imagination would run away with you too, such as his obviously did." "Where did you think you were?" one of the reporters asks Ferris as they take him out of the hangar on a stretcher. "A place I don't ever want to go again," he tells them. The general, contemplating upon the failure of the test, muses out loud in particular to nobody, "You see, we can feed the stomach with concentrates. We can supply microfilm for reading, recreation, even movies of a sort. We can pump oxygen and waste material out. But there's one thing we can't simulate that's a very basic need. Man's hunger for companionship. The barrier of loneliness. That's the one thing we haven't licked yet. The barrier of loneliness. The palpable, desperate need of the human animal to be with his fellow man. Up there in the vastness of space and the void that is the sky. Up there is an enemy known as isolation. It sits there in the stars, waiting in the Twilight Zone. And in this moment, Serling starts the show with a thesis that will carry throughout until its final episode, on the undeniable need for man to be able to rely on one another. Not just for emotional support, but also economic, communal. The human animal is a social one, and this will be a topic that we will revisit over and over again within his work. One for the Angels tells the story of Lou Bookman, a toy salesman who always meant to but never has really made something of himself. Just never made the time for it, really. And now he has blinked and found himself to suddenly be at the end of his life, visited by a man dressed all in black, who is here to take him with him. But it appears that even in death you still have to deal with bureaucracy, as Mr. Reaper will let him go for one of 3 reasons. If his absence in this life would create a substantial great hardship for someone else, which does not apply to him. If he is a great thinker and is on the cusp of finishing his most important contribution to humanity and just needs more time to see it through. Which, again, is not particularly the portrait of Lou Bookman. But the third might just be. Which is a clause on unfinished business that would leave the soul restless if it was not seen to. Bookman has always wanted to give that one great toy pitch to a company, a moment that really matters, where something that he does brings a modicum of joy to this world, even if it is just in the form of cheap plastic for children. And his wish is granted. His death is postponed until after he can make a great toy sale, which Bookman then sees as a selfish chance at immortality, as he decides after making this wish that he will no longer pursue his dream of making a great toy to be on the market, and as such, will never have to die. This episode does demonstrate some of the goofiness in the series that, while endearing, usually can sometimes date the show in ways that they did not intend, or always work in its favor. Such as in this episode, they needed a toy for the salesman to be selling, and so they took this pre-existing robot toy and slapped an eye sticker on it to make it more Twilight Zone-y and creepy. But it has the unintentional effect of just being a little bit weird and distracting. Not a huge issue at all. But in examining the entire show, I think it is important to signal when they take swings and when they miss, because often in those moments it stands out as interesting, at least it does to me. And while speaking on tone, I also do not think that they have fully nailed down their aesthetic yet of how they wanted the show to be, where intellectually they are dealing with the same sorts of issues that they always will until the end of the series. But as far as how they are decorating these sets and shooting them, they've not developed a great sense of mood yet. Now, they will never go full-on dark shadows with it, but as the show progresses, they will take on a heavier lens of horror and lighting than what we see here in early episodes such as this, that visually look much more like a 1950s sitcom. Actually, I think that point can be demonstrated by the fact that they basically will remake this episode later down the line with Season 3's Nothing in the Dark, which basically has the exact same concept, but is executed in a much more professional and compelling way from basically any angle that you look at it. This doesn't make One for the Angels bad. It is a decent first attempt, but it does show a slight weakness that they had out the gate before, fully establishing what this show was even going to be. And this episode, in that same mindset, also delves into much darker material on a thematic level than later episodes of the show would be willing to flirt with. Which I even find shocking that they were able to get away with this in 1959, because the central concept of the episode is revolving around child death. As since our main protagonist cannot die, then death must take another, who just so happens to be a girl who is one of his best customers. And this all ends with Lou Bookman realizing that his gift for salesmanship and bullshit is actually his gift to humanity, as he's able to distract death in a conversation for so long that he gets behind in his duties and has to spare the girl's life as a result. Not a bad episode again, but not really a particularly good one either, and it represents the occasional bland entry into what usually is an otherwise exceptional series across the board. But be warned, this journey will encounter a fair amount of duds as we go along on it. The original run of the series had 156 episodes, and only 15 or so of them are actually really well known still. So while I obviously think that most of it is great, there's also a substantial part of the series that is just okay. Which, speaking of that, Mr. Denton on Doomsday is unfortunately another that I'm not tremendously fond of. I like Western movies, but I don't particularly care for that brand of 1950s televised Western that this episode is clearly modeling itself off of. And I think that anytime the Twilight Zone dips its toes into it, it doesn't yield the most amazing results. I've never really liked media that relies too heavily on tropes, and there probably isn't a single era of fictionalized media that has ever existed that did so to such a ubiquitous level as was done with 50s television westerns. And even seeing that through the lens of Serling's sharp, critical social eye, this still does little for me. And truth be told, I can't even really give much of an objective review of it because of how little it does for me just on a very personal level. Good rule of thumb for you if this is the first time that you're seeing the show is that if you turn on an episode and the first thing that you see is cowboys, then it's probably best to just skip it. This was undeniably, though, weirdly an aesthetic that Serling was creatively called to work in, as a year after The Twilight Zone was cancelled, he would return to TV as the creator of The Loner, a straightforward post-Civil War western that ran for 26 episodes before it too was cancelled, of which Serling wrote 15 of. And this probably relates back to the fact that he would have rather been writing tight-knit political dramas, and that westerns were closer to that than sci-fi and horror were on an analogous level. Honestly, just based on base conceptual level, I also don't really find this scary or thought-provoking, and is kind of just 2 steps away from something that Woody Allen would have done in the 1970s. It tells the story of Al Denton, the local town drunk, in an Old West community who is the laughingstock of all the other men. He lives on the streets begging for alcohol, and is being kicked around by the world until he's given a magic gun by a man named Mr. Fate, that always hits its target no matter how fearful or drunk the shooter is. We learn that he became a drunk in the first place because he was once the cowboy that was the best shot in the region, and that he killed so many men who challenged him to duels that it drove him mad and to drink, and now he fears that this magic gun will start that horrible ritual all over again. It ends with a duel where Denton realizes at the last moment that the other man too has a gun given to him by fate, and they both fire and hit each other, but both men survive, deciding to leave gunfighting behind and move on with their lives. I don't even know what it's trying to say about the nature of fate, or on the nature of anything really at all. As a story, it feels very confused, and is a total misfire from just about every angle that you look at it, and unfortunately adds to this show having a kind of rocky start out the gate. And right now, before we continue, I'd like to talk to you for just a moment about the future of what I am doing here, and how you can support me in doing it if you so choose. If you've seen my work in the past and you enjoyed it, then I'd like to ask you to consider supporting me on Patreon. It is the only way that I'm able to keep the lights on around here, and it keeps me doing what I do. I have also started a second side channel called IPOS Dark Sides that focuses on shorter videos on single cult films. And on Patreon, I'm going to be giving some bonus content, as well as running future polls on the types of work that you would like to see me cover here, as well as over on Dark Sides. I know I've been away a bit, but I'm working on a larger series about the history of werewolves at the moment that is getting really close to being able to shoot, and any support that I can get to get me there will always be appreciated. Today, I would personally like to thank Andrea Emberton, Aaron Sharrock, Aubrey Franks, Audrey Gore, and Brody Lockhart. Thank you genuinely from the bottom of my heart. It means the world to me in being able to continue to do this. And now back to the show. The 16mm Shrine is a misguided early episode that strangely does something that Serling was not often known to do, which was to lean heavily on an already pre-existing work, as this film is reminiscent and riffing on the film Sunset Boulevard that was made 9 years previously, which was extremely intentional on their part. As a joke, they even brought back the composer of that film, Franz Waxman, to write the score for this episode. Now, I normally would really hate this kind of riffing, and truth be told, I don't entirely love it here. But he uses it primarily as a footing to take a step further into a horror direction that could serve as kind of a prototype for later works such as Death Becomes Her and The Substance, which is kind of fun to see being played out here decades before those films would ever be made. It is also important to mention that this is the first episode of the show that stars a woman, something which they failed to do as often as they should have, as they were often really well done, and serve as great looks into other aspects of that particular time in American life. It tells of Barbara Jean Trenton, whose world is a projection room, whose dreams are made out of celluloid, a once star who spends the winter of her life chasing a fleeting high of her glory years that has now been gone from this world for decades, only remembered now in those flickering images that she obsesses over in the recesses of her home in the dark of night, dreaming of a state of being that can never be again, dreaming of a world without change, where no one gets older, where no one gets sick or dies, static and unending. And in this, I do wish to point out something that we will see again and again within Serling's work, where even if the narrative structure is different, the base fears are all the same, repetitions and variations of tone and setting, but the same in their core base values, which is a fear of the passing of time, and the ramifications of what that passing does to all things under the sun. And this fear manifests in the life of ex-star Barbara Trenton in ways that are detrimental to actually living her life. as she has for 20 years now clung to this vision of what she once was, rather than what she could be now in this moment of the present. Sitting and refusing to move or even acknowledge the passing of time, literally saying that she closes her eyes to the modern world in exchange for the memories of how good the past had been to her. Turning down every part that comes her way because they're asking for mothers or side roles playing occupations associated with older women, which has resulted in her fading into total obscurity, rather than mold and change her image in conjunction with this new stage of her life. Not to be rude here, but to put it in real-life terms, she's kind of taken the path of a Cameron Diaz rather than a Meryl Streep, being in her 50s and rarely acting, seeking roles mostly intended for women in their 20s and 30s, rather than deciding to gracefully age in the public eye, and seek parts in smaller films that are complemented by her status as an aged Hollywood starlet. And in an attempt to scare her out of this mindset, her agent invites her old co-star to the mansion for lunch to visit, and she is mortified at just how much he's aged since the last time that she's seen him. She cannot accept the reality of what is there plainly in front of her eyes, instead turning her back to the passage of time and the man that she has known for most of her life, to instead talk to a photograph on the wall of a version of a man who no longer exists. Barbara Trenton is a woman so out of time that her desire is strong enough to manifest a portal in her personal movie screen for her to venture back into her glory days of her youth. Something which, when discovered by her maid, produces one of the most visceral and haunting screams in the entirety of horror film history. She leaves our world with the blow of a kiss, and disappears into a world of her fancy, sealing into a tomb of the jitter of a movie projector, where she is queen, and will be young and loved forever. A world where nobody dies. A world of impossible make-believe up there in the Twilight Zone. Walking Distance is one of my favorite episodes of the show, and in my opinion actually pairs quite nicely with the 16mm Shrine, retrospectively making that episode better through comparison. It can be to an extent be seen as the masculine version of the same story reflected in a mirror, which tells of Martin Sloan, a late 30s ad executive vice president, who flees his life out of a breakdown brought on by the mental stress of the demands of his career, who is stopped with car troubles at the crossroads of reality, the demands of the present, and the memory of the ease of the past, where he will for an afternoon find himself tempted by nostalgia for a time that once was, from when he was just a boy, that can no longer be, out of a direct contention with the insanity of what the modern world has become, and maybe has always been for adults with jobs and responsibilities and expectations that come with all such things. For one afternoon, he is literally transported to this place of his memory, of his childhood hometown, and he can't come to terms with the fact that he is a piece that no longer fits in this puzzle, that one cannot simply just go home again, because home is a malleable thing that is defined explicitly by the time and people that it is inhabited by. And if one does attempt to go and live in the past, all they will be met with is rejection, because they too are something that has been changed and irrevocably altered by the horrible passing of time, and can no longer fit or mold with this environment as they once did when they were younger. Something that takes Martin Sloan time to learn in this memory trip back to what was his home, but has not been for many years except perhaps within his own mind. Something that we today still refuse to acknowledge around us, as we reboot shows and film franchises with actors who are now old, but are acting as if little to no time has passed outside of joking remarks about bad backs and aching knees. You can only go home again if your home or understanding of the world was never truly real in the first place, and existed only within your mind. And for Martin, realizing that there will never be another marching band rehearsal or carnival that is intended for a 16-year-old version of himself, and that he is looking down the barrel of another few decades of advertising meetings, where they try and figure out how to sell 15% more shoelaces this year, or wood glue than they did last year, is too much for him to bear. He is overburdened by the realities of a system that he has somehow found himself trapped within, despite walking the path to get there knowingly for decades. How we all equally get one chance to walk this road to the same inevitable conclusion, and somehow all stumble into traps that are the same making and function, yet are uniquely designed for our specific, unique selves. And no amount of trying to walk back down that trail to those early days of merry-go-rounds and cotton candy will reverse the fact that the only way through those traps is to simply go through them. Time changes everything, even the problems that we once saw as insurmountable. To move forward without looking back, to live in the now, and through that, recognize that that is the only meaningful way to enact the change around oneself and one's situation in which they have found themselves within in this world, which is something that Martin has to learn by taking that trek back and selfishly forcing a younger version of himself to share a portion of one of those rare elusive summers, before realizing the folly of it all, and going back down that road to his adult life that is defined by his adult job, and getting in that car and driving away to face the problems of that life that could never be solved by reminiscing on a time when the air was sweeter and the days seemed to go on end forever. And now I'd like to take the time to thank you for watching this first part of this new series, and would like to tell you that you can watch part 2 today, right now, on my second channel, IPOS Dark Sides, where you can find the link in the description below. All subsequent episodes of The Twilight Zone, Anatomy of a Franchise, will be found there. I hope you enjoyed this, and that you will continue this journey into the unknown with me over there. I hope you have a good evening, and thank you so much for watching.